I hope you enjoy this sweet conversation with Celia Dominguez. We discussed how the process of grief teaches patience because it has a life of its own. We don't control grief. Grief comes when it comes, and often as a teacher. We discussed what it means to recognize we have different lived experiences and we cannot truly understand another person's experience. Celia is a writer, teacher, and entrepreneur. She founded the Sugar Tarot, a soul-centered business teaching tarot for personal development and self-care. Investigating the intersection between tarot, yoga, and mindfulness is one of her main interests in both her personal as well as her professional life. At the moment, she is taking a break to write a book in Spanish, which will be published at the beginning of 2021. The book is written mainly for female-identified folks who want to learn and develop a spiritual practice, but find themselves without time, space, money, or even a tradition to follow. Her mission is to empower people to create a well-informed, unique, and personalized practice. I hope you enjoy this interview.
I see tarot as emotional hygiene. I see tarot as a way to hold a mirror with ourselves, have a conversation with ourselves, checking in, very much like yoga. And that's like, I love mixing both of them. So when you read tarot for other people, there's a bit of a power dynamic. You're reading for them. And I saw that that wasn't what I wanted to do. Although there's always a time and a space to get a reading or to give a reading, that wasn't what I wanted to do. So the tarot, the Sugar Tarot, my business transformed and changed. And it became more about teaching other people, empowering other people to use this self-care and spiritual practice I was using through tarot, through meditation, empower them to find their own ways. And was in this process where I had an idea for a book and I got a book deal. And that's what I'm doing now. I'm writing mainly. And I stopped the Sugar Tarot as a business because there's so much time that you have in the world. And I'm also going to completely revisit the business once the book is finished. I want all the little discoveries, all the practices I'm thinking for the book to bring them into a new way of doing my practice and changing my business. So it won't be as tarot centered. It will be more about empowering other people to find their own practice, to find how they want to do things, to empower women especially, or female identified folks, to take a space for that practice and how to do it. There's many, many different ways to do it. I've been a single mom for many years. I have a day job, and sometimes my spiritual practice is being in the shower, imagining, that the water is golden light that is showering you, and that's my 5-minute mindfulness practice, because sometimes you don't have that time. Sometimes you don't have that mindset either, especially when you look at social media and you see these amazing lives with people that have the money and the time to maybe go for a retreat to Bali, and you're there caught up in your day-to-day, not finding those little moments for a meditation or for yoga or for your tarot practice. So that's where my heart is right now, and that's what I'm exploring and writing about.
I'm excited about the transition that's happening with your work and excited about your book.
Thank you.
Yeah. And when we were talking before I pressed record, we were talking about the idea for this summit and why it feels important to focus on grief and liberation. And you were talking about grief as something that's coming up in your work and the book. And so I'm wondering if you could share some about why it's important to talk about or make space for grief at this particular time. Why is it important to be talking about these themes of grief and liberation now?
Yeah, I think for me, as I see grief, we can go to the micro, to the personal, and then we can go to the macro and the universal. So if we look around the world, if we looked where you're from the States, but also what is happening in England, where I live. I have been here for 10 years. Also what's happening in Spain. The whole world is living a moment of polarization. It almost seems like white supremacy, patriarchy, capitalism as we understand it now, they see that there are systems that need to finish. They know they have to die, and they're a bit like, they always say when an animal is dying is when it's the most dangerous. And these systems are becoming dangerous, are becoming louder, and becoming stronger because they know that they need to finish. They know they need to end. And also we have all these movements from feminism to environmentalism to so many people that are awakening to a new way of doing things. So we're polarizing. So when you look at grief as a macro, as a collective thing, if we don't let grief to happen, I don't think we're going to be able to bridge that gap that we're living right now with this polarization. I think when you don't allow people in an individual way or collective way, you're silencing them. You are denying history. Because if you deny grief, you deny a reason for that grief, and you deny the reason itself. So if we want to bridge that gap, if we want to end this polarization, if we want to shift the paradigm, we need for grief from an individual to the collective happen and breathe.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What you said, all of it was powerful, and something that really struck me is what you shared about when an animal dies. When it's dying, it's the most dangerous, right? Dangerous time, and I think you're right. These systems are dying and trying to hold on to life at the same time, right? And movements are really resisting the continued existence of these systems.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned polarization, and so I'm wondering how that shows up for you individually, like, because there's the collective polarization, and then I think we embody what's going on externally.
Yeah.
How does that show up for you?
I'm a huge example of polarization, although it doesn't show on my skin, maybe, doesn't show in other things that might be more obvious. But just to give a bit of background, I'm from Spain. My family is from mom and dad side from the south of Spain. But both families migrated in the 50s, like many people in Spain, to Catalonia, which is a region with a different culture, a different language. And is now fighting, some people in Catalonia, for independence. It has been for a long time in different forms and shapes. So I was born in Catalonia to these Spanish parents. Actually, they didn't learn Catalan until they were adults. Actually, I didn't start speaking Catalan until I was 7, and my parents changed me to a different school. We used to live what it will be the Spanish ghetto within the city, but they want us to move to the Catalan area because education was very good there. And to go to better schools, we moved to that area, and I actually started speaking proper Catalan when I was 7. So I'm always been in no man's land with things. My family's culture is in Spanish, but in Catalonia. My mother tongue is Spanish. My native language, the one I got my education, my social life, is Catalan. My parents were very extreme poor, or coming from extreme poor working class. And I went and I grew up in the Catalan area, which was middle class. I will grew up in a city, but then we will go to see our family in the south of Spain, and it will be completely rural to the point of 300 people in one village, and seeing the old men coming back on their donkeys from the fields, which was a complete clash. So my whole life has been being in between classes, being in between languages, being in between backgrounds. Where I grew up was completely secular, but if you go to the south of Spain, the influence of Catholicism is huge to the point that it has wiped out so much of the knowledge about nature, about the ancestors. So, and now I live in England, which is another polarization. When I'm in Spain, I'm white. When I'm in England, I'm not so white. I have a lot of the privilege of the white class, but many folks here always love to remind you you're not white, you have exotic olive skin or an exotic accent. Especially in England, the accent is almost as important for some people as the skin when it comes to define people and separate them. So I have thrived in a world and in a life that didn't allow me to belong to anything 100%. Not a nation, not a language, not a state. And that's been a huge theme on that polarization. And now Spain is living in a moment where there's a lot of problems between Catalonia and Spain. A lot of them. So it's almost like mom and dad are fighting all the time and you're in the middle of it. You know, and I might have my opinions, but at the end of the day, what you want to see is mom and dad to stop fighting, because these two cultures, which have so many problems right now, are my cultures, are where I come from, both of them. So that separation, that otherness has been a huge theme. And I think now it's getting worse and worse. If you look at what is happening with England, being with Brexit, being an immigrant here is part of that polarization. You go back to Catalonia and Spain, you're part of that polarization. And you constantly feeling torn apart between cultures and languages and even ideologies.
Mm-hmm. And I imagine that creates grief for you, an experience of grief and loss for you, being in the middle and also yearning for the fighting to stop and the polarization to stop.
Yes, yeah, it's been a yearning and a you know, I always explain, this is my case, and you will hear other cases of other Catalan or Spanish people talking different experiences. By no means my personal experience is other people's experience, but my Catalan identity wasn't formed in Catalonia. No one came to me in school or, you know, in our neighborhood and said to me, you're Catalan. My Catalan identity came from going to my grandma's village in the south of Spain and people telling me, you're Catalan, but don't dare say that you feel Catalan. You're Spanish, but you're Catalan. And you're like, okay. So you're calling me the Catalan, but also you're telling me, don't you dare identify yourself as a Catalan, because that's threatening to us. Because if you identify yourself as a Catalan, if you voice it, it means that you are independentist, and we don't like those. Mm-hmm. And it's like, I'm neither of those. I'm all of it, and I'm not of it. You know, I belong to here and I belong to there. It doesn't mean that I want to separate, or it doesn't mean it's so simple that everyone is the same, because it's not. You know, you can accept all these differences and at the same time realize that we're all in one space. And when we cut up so much into these arguments of your this, your that, in my case, what I saw is other things such as social justice were completely bypassed. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. In my case, in other cases, obviously, to see those differences is what you need to do. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm. So there was a yearning and there was a grief of an identity that was never completely defined. It was very, very difficult to define myself. It still is. The difference is now I went through that grief process and I realized that you belonged to where you are at the moment. You belong to the people in your life mainly. At least is how I saw it. But it was a huge grief that I had to go through years. It's almost, you don't know where your ancestors are. You don't know exactly what your culture is. You, even now, when I go back to Spain, people say I have English accent when I speak Catalan or Spanish. So I'm never going to be one thing, which is fun and is giving me a lot of perspective, I have to say. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah, and you said I'm all of it and none of it, which I really appreciate. Like, it's real, this experience you're naming, and there's also an awareness of the complexity, right? And the polarity in that of like, I'm all of it and I'm none of this too. Mm-hmm. And just what you named about I mean, I think so often identity is defined for us. We actually are not necessarily given the agency by systems to define who we are or share the narrative about who we are on our terms. And that's a lot of
Mhm.
what you're talking about. Um, and you did name grief in there, that has come up for you. And so I'm curious about lessons, or one lesson that grief has taught you. And it could be related to what you just shared, or something else.
Yeah, I mean, all the processes of grief, because obviously when you invited me to this conversation and we discussed the questions that might come up, I thought about all the grief processes I've gone through in my life. And the point in common I found that I have learned the most in my personal experience is patience. Grief teaches you patience because it has a life of its own, and it can last years, it can last a whole life. You can't just do a few meditations and then grief is gone. Sometimes it happens with a very powerful experience, but in general, it has an energy of its own. It almost every type of grief has a different spirit to it. And it can be a very helpful spirit, or it can become very damaging, depending whether you feed that or you ignore it. So as I visualize grief as this energy that has a nucleus. So if you go through it, if you let it happen, if you inquire about that grief, if you try to be honest about that grief, because so much grief has a base, a foundation of shame. There's grief for things that have been done to you or your culture. There's grief that is because something has been imposed or taken away from you. But there's also grief of ideas, grief of the idea that because you're spiritual, you're a good person, and then you look at your lineage and your lineage has done a lot of bad things, and you need to grieve that idea. I mean, if I look at the lineage, I don't know where the shamans were, and I know they were there, but it was so many hundred years ago, because for generation after generation, my family's been very influenced by Catholic religion, where it's been cut up from the idea of the feminine. You go to my grandma's house in my grandma's village, and she's a lovely woman. I love her. She's strong. She has so much of the good things of my lineage.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, you look around and there are plates with misogynistic jokes on it, like this Spanish kind of plates. And you look around and there's no one picture of any of the women in the family, is only the men, including my son. There's a picture of my son, there's not a picture of me. So sometimes you have to grieve these ideas. And if you let that happen, when you get to the nucleus I was talking about, you find truths. That's what grief gives to you. And all these truths sound a little bit like cliches. So patience. What it is, and what is not. That's a huge lesson of grief for me too. You need to accept what it is. All these cliches are there in grief, in its nucleus, in its core. The difference is we read these truths on Instagram and quotes all day long. But when you go through grief, you're not just reading them, you're not just posting them because they sound good. You are embodying them, you're feeling them, you live by them. Because otherwise, if you don't live by those truths, grief is going to become a monster that is going to eat you up. Or you go the other side and you completely bypass.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just love the nucleus part of this, and the what grief has taught you related to things that sound like cliches but are real, right? Patience and truth, and the idea that if we don't respond to grief, our own grief and our collective grief, that it will consume us, right? If we don't actually turn towards it and engage with it, because it does have a life of its own, then it will actually has the power to consume us in some way. And so I'm wondering if you can share about an experience of grief that led you to more freedom, liberation, ease, whatever language resonates for you.
I have many. But I think probably the most important I would like to talk about, because it's what started this process that brought me into my practice of yoga, meditation, and tarot, was it was the grieving on an idea. It was the when you need to grieve a life that you thought was going to be and is not anymore. I mean, I could talk about other experiences, but I think that's important because it's what has led me to meet you through Instagram and to be in this conversation with you now. So the life that wasn't taken, that didn't happen, and I had to grieve, was when I became a single mom when I was 6 months pregnant. I was engaged to be married to the father of the child, and when I was 6 months pregnant, he left. Things had gone a bit rocky since I had found out I was pregnant, wasn't planned. And to be honest, looking back, it's been 7 years. That was the best thing that could happen for everyone, for my fiance at the time, which after many years now, we have a very good relationship. For my son, for myself, because everything that has happened in my life has come out of that moment where I became a woman that had to grieve the idea of what a family will be, had to grieve the idea of what a woman is, had to grieve the idea of what a mom is and how she's going to act. And I think it's such a good practice to learn to grieve properly the life moments that don't happen, or the life paths we don't choose or are not choosing for us. And so many times around me, I see people that are in crossroads in their life, and they go through one path, or something happened and they are forced to go down that path, but they don't take a minute to grieve that. Thanks to me grieving that life that hadn't happened, thanks to me to cry through it, to inquire about it, to go to the nucleus of it, because the truth in the nucleus wasn't about the life I didn't want. I knew deep down in me there was something in me that had always been very curious about what it would be to be a single mom. It's like sometimes things happen in a way, and you knew there was, if you're very honest and integrity, there was always a part of me that had curiosity about that, and happened. But at the nucleus of it, it wasn't that I wanted to be with my fiance. And at the core of it, it wasn't that I wanted a mainstream type of family. At the core of my pain and my grief was that experience was confirming all my resistances and all my fears around self-worth. And that was my grief. Mm. And I was forced through that grief to change the paradigm of my life, where I was looking something externally to validate that I was loved. You know, everything with my ex-partner had gone down the line of what we all think a love story should be, a family story should be. You meet the guy, you date, he's super romantic, he proposed in Portugal on a beach, then I got pregnant, then we're going to have the wedding, and all of it. That was never what I wanted. What I wanted was validation that I deserved to be loved. And that was where my grief came. And from being honest and inquiring that, and that didn't happen in months, that happened in years. And a lot of practice, and a lot of going back to the yoga mat, and a lot of crying when it had to happen. But without letting that grief teach me, without feeling the feelings, I wouldn't have come to the truth that at the root of it, there always was a problem with self-worth.
Mm-hmm. Mm. Yeah, it's powerful. Thank you for sharing what you shared. And also really part of what I heard is like this experience of grief made you or allowed you to get to the truth of what was going on, right? Like what was underneath that needed to be unearthed or excavated and worked with related to self-worth or what you always
Mm-hmm.
believed you wanted, right? And I think grief does have the capacity to um, wake us up to things that we may not want to see or
Yeah.
feel or experience.
And maybe that's why other people griefs makes us so uncomfortable, and we don't usually give a space or allow or support other people's griefs, especially when their grief might tell us truths that we don't want to listen or hear.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So it's, I think grief has almost two different energies. There's the one that is passive and very feminine, and it will be crying, will be finding a place and going through the grief. And there's the more young energy that is taking a space for that grief and telling people around you, even society, no, this is my grief, and I'm going to take the space and look at it. Like there's like those two energies. There's the energy of just let it happen and let the grief go through you, but there's also the energy of inquiring and informing and learning maybe why you have that grief. Um, Exploring your family. Like I have grief because my grandma's village, not everyone, but they were peasants and they were shepherds, and they joined the fascists when they came during the Civil War. And that's a grief that is in me. I can't look back and say my family fought against them. My grandmother was never with them because the fascists killed a cousin or someone in the family she really, really loved. And that made her always to vote for the socialists and be against the fascists. But it wasn't an informed decision, it was emotional response to what had happened. But my family didn't vote back. Obviously, maybe they couldn't, but that's a grief I have to go through. And that means inquiring, that might be means proactive, that might means going through history and maybe unearth uncomfortable truths.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're naming some just different ways we respond to grief and also some practices or rituals or questions that you allow to come forth when you're in a process of grieving. So I'm wondering if you can share some about, and you named yoga earlier, and meditation practices or rituals that have helped support you through your own process of grieving.
Yeah, I think yoga, it's been a constant in my grief. Um, the movement and the breathing, and your book explains that so beautifully. So if anyone in the summit hasn't read it, they should read it because it explains so well the intimate space of the yoga mat and how it holds a space for grief and other practices, but also how it teaches to step out of the mat and take it to other places. Um, I remember a couple of summers ago, I went back to my grandma's village, and a year before that, I had been thinking that maybe before my son will start school, I had to leave England, go back to my origins, and go back to Spain. But something in me didn't want to go back to Barcelona, where I'm from, where I grew up. I wanted to go back to my grandma's village. There was a lot of let's start a new life and let's do it there. So I realized that that wasn't the path I was going to take. That the inquiry in itself had unearthed so many things I needed to explore and think about, but my place, my path wasn't going to be moving there. I decided that, and then a year later, I went to visit the place. And I just wanted to cry all the time, and I didn't know why, you know? And it was a heat wave. We were at 50 degrees in the shade. It was like it was 2 years ago. It was like I think it was on a global scale. Like at least the whole of Europe had this horrendous heat wave, and I just remember being completely sweaty, and I just wanted to cry. At some point, I had to go to the street there were like some fields and things like that. I was just crying there. And I just didn't know, but I just had to cry. But I couldn't stop the crying. What I had to do to cry and at the same time stop it mindfully and slowly, so I wouldn't be crying forever. And mind you, it wasn't only crying about the life I hadn't taken. I wasn't only saying goodbye to the life I would have had if I had moved there. It was also, I think, every time I go there, there's a lot of ancestral grief I have to go through. But the only way I could stop it was to get on the yoga mat and let myself cry with every movement, and go from something like getting onto child pose and cry to then go into mountain pose and take a space and let those two energies go through me and teach me and transform me. And you start crying and you start laughing, which is beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
And then my other practice, it will be with tarot, very important, because sometimes we're grieving and we don't know why. And tarot holds that mirror. Or sometimes we know why we're grieving, but we don't know, or we can't see, or our ego is taking place. So we don't see that core we were talking about, those truths. Mm-hmm. So you can always go back to tarot and say, what is this grief teaching me? Or what I'm not seeing about this right now? Or what is the best time to grieve? So I could give like very systematic practices, but I think it's more, my biggest recommendation will be for people to have curiosity and to keep inquiring, to keep checking in. Do I need to go into my mat and just cry? Or do I need to go and check my cards or check myself, or whatever technique people like? Because not everyone likes yoga and not everyone likes tarot. Mm-hmm. But it might be journaling. Just ask the question, keep inquiring, keep checking in, keep seeing whether it is time to take a space and share your grief in a public way, or is it time to do it at home and just be with yourself? I think self-questioning will be my biggest advice when it comes to grief.
Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah, and it sounds like at least the practices you named are yoga and meditation and tarot are practices that you said tarot can mirror an experience back. And I think that yoga and meditation and tarot can hold the questions, right? That they have the capacity to hold the questions. Mm-hmm. And in a way that, at least I live in North Carolina, I've always lived in the US. I feel like there's a cultural norm around needing to know the answer, not actually sitting with the question. And I think the practices you named are like, be with the questions, that they're powerful and big enough to hold the questions that come up. And that's actually the process of moving through grief, right? Is being with the questions.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah.
At the beginning of our conversation, you were talking about systems and culture, and I'm wondering what it might look like if culture prioritized spaces for us to grieve, to have this conversation, right, on a collective scale. What would that look like? What could it look like?
I think it will facilitate the shift of paradigm we were talking about in the beginning. I think accepting other people's griefs or grieving processes, mm-hmm. Accepting their pain and their history, accepting that everyone is not only has the right to self-define themselves, but also to recognize that we all have different type of pain we're dealing with. We all have our process. And bringing that to the collective, it will be a shift of paradigm. It will be probably the end of silencing. You can't allow grief if you're still silencing, if you're still changing history, if you're still bypassing, you know. I have seen it in my own country. And that's something I would recommend to people in the summit, to see the history of other countries. Sometimes I feel that I especially live in England, and people here know what's happening in the US and what's happening in England, in the UK, but they don't know what is happening anywhere else in the world. What is happening now in Spain? What is happening in Chile? What is happening in other countries? We need to also see that our grief is happening in other places, similar one, and informing on ourselves is so important, so important to have this global outlook at what's happening. But in Spain, after the dictatorship, there was what we call la transición, the transition. They wanted a democratic, peaceful transition, which in a lot of ways was quite well orchestrated. In other ways, what it did is completely bypass a lot of people that should have gone to prison didn't go to prison. A lot of ideologies that should have been completely questioned and even go through processes to really know what is systemic and what is not, what should change and what should not. It didn't happen in my country. And you find people that are very sad, you find people that are very angry, but you also find a lot of people that are completely ignoring what happened. You still find people that say, when Franco was alive, we all had jobs and streets were cleaner. Life was better with him. And completely bypassing everything that is around you. And that creates a grief in all of us. We name it or not. We want to look at it or not. And allowing that grief, and that starts with a person, that starts with the kid that is crying, and we don't go and say, boys don't cry. Mm-hmm. And we go back to the micro. Taken into the macro could be a change of paradise. In my view, there's no space for silencing if we give a space for grief.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's poignant. What you just named about silence and grief and the connection between the two, and how grief actually doesn't allow for silence to continue, right? It's not possible if we're actually looking at what is real, what is happening around us, to us, where we're implicated in what's happening, right? How we're perpetuating harm, and just patterns, because you mentioned history, so none of this is new. And the importance of us needing to look outside of our space, like where we live, where we are, because the grief that I experience as a Black woman in the US is mirrored across the world somewhere, right? It may not look the same as my grief, but it's coming from a similar place because patterns of oppression are similar.
Yeah, right? Yeah. And if you have a good practice of allowing your grief to happen and to teach you and those that you love, it's going to be so much easier to understand other people. Mm-hmm. Or at least give them a space to be who they are and go through what they have to go. Mm-hmm. Like, I'm never going to even imagine what you go through as a Black woman in the States. It will be insulting for me to say, I know what you go through, you know? But I know my grief, I know my experience. And that takes me to a place where I don't need to understand it because I know I will never walk in your shoes. But I can find ways to support, allow, give a space, etc. because I had to go through that myself.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that grief and being in touch with it actually makes space for connection, right? Like when we're honest about the fact that all of us are grieving in some way in response to what's going on in the collective and culturally, and not just in the space where we live, but collective grief all over the world and for the planet, right? And what we're doing to that it creates space for intimacy and connection.
Yes, I did an exercise with a friend the other day. We were talking about grieving the lack of a space as a woman is a form of violence, in the sense that we take for granted the fact that when you're a woman and you're alone coming back very late at night, you're in danger. you don't feel safe in your own space, in your own city. And we have completely taken it for granted. It's only normal, taken over, you know what I mean? And we don't grieve the lack of a space to breathe, to walk around at night and feel safe. This is a kind of one of these things that have been taken away from us as a woman around the world, that we don't even have the moment to go and say, let's grieve the lack of a space. Something very simple that we're so used to. And that, and especially like in Barcelona, I feel quite safe at night walking around. Like I know people really complain about robberies and robberies. But in Bristol, where I'm from, cities are much more like American cities. They are not as walkable, there are more roads. So if you find yourself walking from point A to point B at night, which is only 10 minutes, if you just have to go through a park or something like that, that's it. You go back to that space of oppression where, you know, you're not safe, you know that if you're screaming, no one will hear you. And if something happens to you, there's a high percentage of possibilities that the judge is going to say is your fault because you were going through a dark place at night. And that happens. Mm-hmm. So we were talking about oppression. It's like, I'm never going to be able to walk other people's shoes. But when I imagine how I have felt in a dark alley at night, I just try to imagine that some people live in that space constantly, in that dark alley at night, when they go to the supermarket, when they take their kids to school. So I'm never going to walk on other people's shoes, but I can do the exercise of knowing what oppression is in a tiny bit and allowing other people to say, yes, we're oppressed. Yes, that's what happens to us. Mm-hmm. Because the worst thing you can do to other people that go through grief, through cultural grief, is just to dismiss it. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So don't say you know what they go through, but don't dismiss it either. And just take that worst moment of oppression you might have felt at some point and imagine those people live 24/7 in there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're naming the sort of what I hear is like building the muscle of being able to hold both multiple truths because we aren't having the same experience, and to hold someone else's pain and empathize without actually having had that experience, right? It's like this way to build compassion and empathy and connection instead of saying, well, I know what that's like, right? When in reality, we don't know what anyone else's experience is like. We don't know what it's like living in their body or navigating the world in their body, right? We don't know. Yeah,
no,
it's powerful.
It's about knowing, like, I have dipped my toe in my grief, my oppression, my lack of freedom. So that allows me to be the person that says, yes, I can see what you're going through, and I'm giving a space for that. Mm-hmm. You're not going, you know, in some things to just say I know what you're going through. It's not completely authentic, and it's not healthy. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that's where, you know, so much bypassing is coming, especially in the spiritual world. It's like, oh, I'm doing a lot of personal development, so I know what everyone is going through. No.
Right. It's dangerous. Mm-hmm. That's dangerous.
Yeah.
So at the beginning, the meditation that wasn't recorded because somehow the recording stopped, I asked you what you're holding in your heart, and I'm wondering what came up for you.
Oh, thank you. Actually, like I took, I was paying a lot of attention to that because we were going to talk about grief. I realized when I was paying attention to my heart that a lot of voices were coming up. Mm. A lot of different voices were in my heart going like, listen to me, or voice me, or I'm here, because it's such a big subject that we don't allow ourselves to talk about it a lot. That when you're given this space, and thank you for giving me this space, all these voices went to come up at once, and they were all in my heart. I could feel them, all these different big and smaller griefs with their spirit and their energy were there in my heart, like almost bubbling. That's where I felt.
Mm-hmm. So all the people and stories and energies wanted to come forward. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So I have one more question I want to ask, and it's about liberation.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the theme of the summit is grief and liberation, and I've really been thinking about we have to grieve to actually to find that space of liberation and freedom. So what does collective liberation mean to you?
I think it's a mix of healing and accountability. And I think grief and the grief process is one of the best paths to get there, or the best tools to use to get there. So if as a collective we could recognize that we're one, something that is said in the spiritual world a lot, but at the same time every voice needs to be heard, and we all need to hold ourselves accountable, and we all need to do the work individually. If that doesn't happen, there's no liberation. We have in the Western world a few decades of experience with ideas such as we are one, and that has helped a lot of people. But we look around, and as we said, we're living a moment of polarization.
Mm-hmm.
How we reconcile again the big ideas of love and we're all one, and race and culture doesn't define us, because in a level it doesn't, but then it completely does. How we reconcile both. How can we reconcile I'm not a bad person, but it doesn't mean I'm a good person either. Reconciling that white people, and I include myself in that, because even if they I'm not considered completely white, I do have the white privilege in this country. If we all white people look at ourselves and say, okay, I'm trying to do the best I can, but I won't be there till I also recognize that all of us have embedded racism in ourselves. So it's that mix of both, as we were saying, the macro and the micro, and the personal and the universal. If we reconcile both of them, then is when liberation will come. It's just not going to happen if we say love everyone and we are one. It needs to be a constant audit of ourselves, a constant checking in, a constant seeing where we're giving and not giving a space to people around us in our practice. So yeah, I really think it's a mix of healing and accountability. If I had to summarize it, I could talk about it for hours, but
Yeah. I appreciate what you said about the spiritual world and we are one and that universal truth. And yet, that doesn't absolve us of accountability to one another, right? Like we need to be accountable because the culture doesn't allow us to be one. That's not actually how we get to live our lives, because of what culture's doing to us and just the patterns of history that you named. And so I appreciate that naming of yes, this is true, and also this is true, and accountability. Healing will not happen unless there is accountability. That's part of what I hear in what you shared.
Yeah. And it's when we check in ourselves, it's like, okay, if you're working towards social justice, if you work in your spiritual practice, because it's what we do, and a lot of people in the summit probably is what they do too. There's grieving when you realize that just doing yoga twice a week doesn't make you a good person that never makes mistakes. Right. There's a grieving process in that. There's I saw my dad growing up. He was mainstream. He never looked like he had been working since he was 13 years old, and he had very homophobic views. He had even racist views. I mean, and he's done a huge change in the last few years. But seeing the process of a man that never had even thought he had to rethink certain views to completely go through, in Tara will be a tower kind of energy where all the foundations of who you are as a white male, again, in the States, he wouldn't look white, but he does look white in Spain, and go like, shit. Just going to work and providing for my family and voting and not killing anyone doesn't make me a good person.
Right.
I have racist views because my daughters are telling me so. And the change of perspective is very, very important with that. And I saw my dad grieving the idea of he used to be in a very big way and having to reconcile that. And we all need to go through that constantly. But if we live in a society where grieving is shamed and oppressed, when that inquiry kind of pops up, kind of like, oh, maybe I should check in with myself and so certain of my views and then grieve this change of identity, that's not going to happen because grief is being suppressed and we don't go through.
Yeah, just the evolution of who we are, that we're constantly changing. And this, I think you're inviting us into the question of like, who am I now? Right? And who am I now? And what do I need to let go of? And that, you know, all of the spiritual work, given the time we're living in, doesn't make us a good person, right? It doesn't guarantee that we won't cause harm, right? And that we don't have implicit bias in some way, or we don't have internalized racism or homophobic views or oppressive thoughts or behaviors.
Yeah. And like I tried one of my practices, and that can go hand in hand with grieving. But one of my practices is to constant check in my thoughts where I see that I'm thinking, even for a split second, something that might be racist, or that is racist. That might racist. I mean, we need to all do it. Because if we don't do that, we're not going to evolve. If we don't do that, we are not prepared to give, to pass on like spaces and opportunities we have to other people, because we're not understanding it. We're not understanding where we are. We just think it's okay, you know? And it is not. It's a constant checking in, a constant practice, just like yoga. Yoga is not something you do once a month. Yoga is something that you do every day if you can, even if it's for 5 minutes, you know. And I know not a lot of people have that time and space, but you can find tiny bits. You know, you can be, as we were saying, contained in your shower and going back through your day where you caught yourself thinking anything that wasn't in line with who you want to be and you think you should be in the world. And then instead of going to a place of shame, go to a place of action.
Yes.
And say how you're going to change that. And it takes time, and it's so easy to fall into shame, and people avoid shame and grief by any cost, and they go together. So that's when we don't want to do that practice. That's when we bypass and we say, oh no, it's fine, but you know, I have plenty of black friends, so I'm not racist or something like that.
Right.
You know, and it is not comfortable. I think in your book you say all this is messy, and it is messy.
It is, all of it, and it's complex, and I think our practice is to be with the mess, right? And because it's not going to be neat or clean, and certainly, you know, the systems that we've been talking about and the process of grief and even finding liberation it's going to be awkward and messy, right? It's not going to be neat and clean and tidy, because the systems that have been set up to cause harm are not neat and clean and tidy, right? And harm doesn't actually happen in that way.
Yeah.
It's not neat, right? It's messy and painful and awkward, and certainly growth can come from the experience of loss and pain as well.
Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's as simple as be part of liberation is to take a step back,
Yeah.
and let another person to take the space. And that's not how we view being active and taking action. But it can have many ways and many shapes and many forms. So yeah.
Celia, thank you so much for everything, and for who you are, and the truths you expressed, and in our conversation, and just the practice and work you do in the world. And as I said, so excited about your book. Can't wait. And I'm curious, this is going to air at the end of January, so it will launch, I think, around January 25th. Are there things coming up in 2020 other than your book that you want people to know about that you're offering?
Well, I have June 2020 as deadline for the book. So after that, I'm going to be launching the new website and the new offerings, etc. So I will say the best way for people to be in touch is just to follow me on Instagram. I think you will share the Instagram link. Yes. And probably on Instagram, there will be the links in bio to whatever I am offering at the time. But I'm very excited not only about the book, I'm trying to rethink how to relaunch the business and the website and my offerings in a way that are different and are more in integrity and in line. And, I'm investigating and I'm asking the community I have online how we could do things differently, how maybe is a business that is not based on newsletter, maybe it's based on a free membership where there's content. So yeah, I think that's what is coming on 2020 is a lot of exploring and trying to set up a different model, at least for me, when it comes to business.
I'll be excited to see your new website and offerings, and continue to follow you on social media. And thank you so much for taking the time to have this conversation today, and thanks for saying yes to participating in the summit.
No, likewise, and thank you so much for the work you're doing in the world in your book. It's been a huge inspiration for me, truly.
I'm so glad. Thank you.
Thank you.